Thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful evening here at the Agora Hills Recreation and Event Center. We have a wonderful program tonight for our annual One City, One Book program. Thank you all for coming. Without any further ado, we're going to get right into it. I wanted to introduce to you our moderator for this evening. She is the communications manager for our own city of Agora Hills, Mary Haddad. And to do some more formal thank yous, it is my privilege to introduce the mayor of the city of Agora Hills, Elise Buckley Weber.
Hello, everybody. Nick came up to me a few minutes ago and just told me, tonight's the last night I'll be introducing you. We've been working together for 13 years, so I'm like, don't make me cry. Anyways, welcome everybody to One City, One Book. I think most people in this crowd probably know this is one of my favorite events of the whole year. And so I want to start with some thank yous. First to the One City, One Book Committee, Agora Hills Library Manager Nina Hull, Katie Magaha, Randy Paller, Tina Johnson, Karen Kent, Joan Jacobone, and Judy Carta. Raise your hands, everybody. And I won't go into detail, but I gave them a very tall order this year, and of course they came through with Lisa C. So it's really a thrill. Thank you for all your hard work and an amazing special event. I'd like to say thank you to our sponsor and partner on this event, the Friends of the Agora Hills Library. President Joan Jacobone is here, along with several of the Friends board members. I'd also like to acknowledge the Cultural Arts Council. I saw Deanna, I saw Karen. I hope I'm not missing anybody else. But I just want to say that they have been so dedicated and devoted to the arts here in Agora Hills for a very long time. And thank you for reminding us that art and culture are so important for the future of our country, I believe. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow council members, Deborah Klein-Lopez, Mayor Pro Tem Penny Sylvester, the chair of our Planning Commission, Kate Anderson. Thank you. And to our staff for this very special event. I can't thank you enough. And thank you to Mary as well. As most of you know, in December, I will be stepping down from the City Council. I've always been a strong advocate of arts and culture, and the City of Agora Hills has elevated itself throughout our region. Our list of authors for One City, One Book alone is beyond impressive for a city of 20,000 residents. I thank all of you for joining us and being open-minded about our choices over the years. I'm a strong believer that through the arts, minds can be opened, resulting in more diverse and inclusive society. Lastly, before we move on, I want to thank our author, Lisa C., for exposing us to women in different cultures. Whether it's hundreds of years ago or in the 21st century, women everywhere are very similar. We want love, we want to be loved, we want to be valued, and we want to be respected. Our similarities are stronger than our differences. I'll now send the program back to Mary to start this special night. Thank you, Mary.
All right. Thank you so much to our incredible mayor, Elise Buckley Weber, for kicking us off so strongly tonight. And thank you to our Community Services Director, Amy Brink, for giving me the opportunity to moderate this year's One City, One Book. Although it has been my absolute privilege and honor to dive into Lady Tan's Circle of Women, the story of Tan Yuan-Shen. My takeaway, no matter who you are and where you come from, the shared experience of womanhood throughout history to present is so powerful. Although I can spend hours standing before you all talking about how wonderful this book is, I think we're all ready to meet our guest tonight, Lisa C. Through her best-selling novels like Lady Tan's Circle of Women, The Island of Sea Women, Snowflower and the Secret Fan, and Shanghai Girls, Lisa has given us stories that bring to life the connections between women across time and cultures. Her work captures our longing for love, our resilience, and the importance of friendship. Inspired by her own family's legacy, her mother a writer and her father an anthropologist, Lisa combines meticulous research with rich historical detail. Her latest book, Lady Tan's Circle of Women, is inspired by the true story of Lady Tan Yuan-Shen, a pioneering female doctor from 15th century China whose remedies are still used today. In addition to her novels, Lisa served as the West Coast correspondent for the Publishers Weekly for 13 years, and her work has appeared in Vogue, Self, and more. She was named National Woman of the Year by the Organization of Chinese American Women and received the History Makers Award from the Chinese American Museum, among other honors. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the iconic Lisa See.
I'll just say it's not every day I'm called iconic, so thank you.
Well, you are. All right, Lisa, well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know we're all feeling pumped and excited to welcome you to the city of Agoura Hills tonight. Tell us, how are you feeling? Let's start there.
Great. I'm wishing the Dodgers were doing a little better tonight, though, unless something happened in the last few minutes. But thank you all so much for coming, and it's just great to be here, and what a beautiful spot you have. It's just amazing.
Thank you so much. And we're so excited to have you and taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak to us today. I know there's tons of fans in the room, people who have read the book already. So we're not going to do too many spoilers tonight, but we are going to dive into the book. But before we do so, again, we're just so grateful to have you in person. And a couple of months ago, we had the chance to sit with you on our city's podcast. So it's not the first time we've touched face-to-face with you. So if you don't mind, I would like to play a small snippet of that podcast that we thought was super interesting.
How do you navigate the blend of fact and fiction in your writing? And what liberties do you allow yourself when crafting the story and allowing some flexibility for creative storytelling?
What a really great question. So I did have some information about her life, and she wrote an introduction to her book, for example, that talks about her childhood and how she was sickly as a girl, and these different anecdotes about her life, but it's pretty limited. So I also did research kind of beyond her life to what life was like for women, what life was like living in one of these big family compounds. A lot of research about medicine in that time, particularly for women, so that there are stories in the novel, and I don't think this gives anything away, but I'll just mention three. Right. The story of the worm, the message that's written on the baby's foot, and what happens to the midwife in the Forbidden City. All of those things happened to real women.
Just a little sneak peek there. And I wouldn't be our communications manager if I didn't put a plug in for our city's podcast. So if you haven't heard our podcast yet, The Good Life of Agoura Hills, please feel free to check it out. We always have amazing guests. Lisa C was our last one. So thank you so much for doing that with us. So Lisa, I can't tell you in the last few months the hype we've gotten since we've announced you as our One City, One Book author. And many of us in the community, including myself, have picked up Lady Tan's Circle of Women and were introduced to your storytelling through Tan Yen-shin and her story. While we'll get into the book shortly, I would love for our audience to just get to know a little bit more about you. I've actually been following you on social media recently.
How do you navigate?
And these are a couple of things that I pulled from your Instagram. And I can tell you're not just passionate about storytelling, but also about the arts, nature, your own family, telling your family's history. So could you tell us a little bit more about who Lisa C is beyond the author?
Well, first of all, I'm just really scared now what you're going to show next. I don't know. I put stuff up there, but
that's
I don't.
All.
Yeah, I will just say that's my son's little dog that I get to babysit on occasion, and I get him tomorrow night for Halloween. So anyway, so that just made me so nervous. So what was the question again?
Could you maybe share with us a little bit more about you beyond storytelling and being an accomplished author?
Well, you just heard, I'm a mother, I'm married, I live not too far, I live in Brentwood, so not too far from here, as long as there isn't traffic. I love to garden. I play tennis twice a week. I do yoga twice a week, and I do Pilates twice a week. Actually, tennis 3 times a week. So I love to hike, and I love to travel. I don't know, what else? What else do you want to know? Actually, I work pretty hard, so I don't have a lot of free time. And, whether, these kinds of books, I heard you had Michael Connolly last year, and I love his books. I just think he's brilliant. But someone was saying earlier that he starts a new book every August 1st. And of course, he produces a book every year. And I love him, so I don't mean this as a criticism at all, but he doesn't have to do this kind of in-depth research like I do for this kind of book, because he's just writing contemporary times, and he's writing about Los Angeles, which he knows. But to do something like this, the amount of research is just, I could do that all day, and it does take me about 2 years. Oh. So I would say, in all honesty, I work very, very hard, and I don't have a lot of extra time. Well, I wish I was a more interesting human, but I'm sorry.
No, that's very interesting. And I mean, as I was going through, everything you post is amazing, by the way. Nothing crazy there. But as I was going through your social media, I couldn't help but to include that photo of, I believe it's your great-grandfather. And I know the focus tonight is Lady Tan's Circle of Women. But I couldn't help but to briefly talk about your first book, where it all started, On Gold Mountain, where you dive into the last 100 years of your family's history and some of the challenges that came from China coming to the US, assimilation, and trying to find success in the country. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about how your Chinese heritage has shaped you as a person, but also as an author?
Yeah, so it was actually my great-great-grandfather was the first person to come here. He came to work on the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. He was an herbalist, so I have an herbalist in my own family. I like to think of this man as one of the original deadbeat dads. You were supposed to come here, work hard, save up your money, and send it back home to China. Not my great-great-grandfather. He had a fondness for women and gambling. And as a result, he didn't send money home. And my great-great-grandmother was so poor in our home village that she used to carry people on her back from village to earn money for her children. And finally, some people took pity on her, lent my great-grandfather, who was only 14 years old, the money to come here. He found his father. By this time, the railroad was completed. He found his father working in Sacramento. He said, Dad, you're a bum. Go home. And he did. And my great-grandfather stayed and did a lot of the jobs that immigrants do even today. He worked in the fields. He washed dishes in restaurants. He swept up in factories. But by the time he was 30, in the 1880s in Sacramento, he had his first business. It was a factory that manufactured crotchless underwear for brothels. Anyway, well, everybody has to have their start in America.
I didn't get to that part of the book yet.
Yeah. Anyway, one day into his shop came a young woman who I think of as being quintessentially American. Her family had come out west on the Oregon Trail. They'd homesteaded in Oregon. We know so much more about what that American pioneer life was like and how hard it was, particularly on women. Mm-hmm. Her mother died when she was a baby. Her father died when she was 7. She was raised by brothers who were reputed to be quite cruel to her. She ran away when she was 18, couldn't afford San Francisco, ended up in Sacramento. No one would hire her. This is the 1895. No one would hire her. And she ended up in Chinatown begging my great-grandfather for a job. And he did hire her to sell what we did call in our family fancy underwear for fancy ladies. And one thing led to another, and they decided to get married. And I use that term very loosely because in those days, it was against the law for a Chinese down to a quarter to marry a white person in this state. It was against the law till 1948. It was against the law in 28 states, most of them all here in the West, and the last of those laws wasn't overturned till 1967. So for these two people to get married, what they did, and I'm going to wrap this up quickly, they went to a lawyer who drew up a contract between two people as though they were forming a partnership. My grandparents went to Mexico to get married, and my own parents were only the second couple in our whole extended family to be legally married here. So this is back in the day before birth control, so people had really big families. He had 12 children, his brother had 12 children, those children had 9 children, each of them. And so when I was a kid, I lived with my mom. Her family was tiny. It was about 10 people. Today there are 4 left. But my father's side of the family was huge. And I did spend a lot of time with them in Chinatown. I'd go to the family store with my grandparents. And I had like 400 relatives here, just in Los Angeles alone, on that side of the family. About a dozen that looked like me, the majority still full Chinese and a spectrum in between. And so, when I was a kid and I looked around me, what I saw were Chinese faces. What I experienced was Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, Chinese language, Chinese food. And that's why I write the kinds of books that I do.
Thank you so much. I know it's not Lady Tan's Circle of Women, the book, but I always, when you meet somebody so successful, it's really interesting to just go back and see the history of that person. So thank you so much for sharing some of that. Speaking of China and Chinese history, I know that China has a very rich, expansive history. Sorry, I don't mean to make you turn your head. Over 5,000 years.
Yeah.
And for many, that might feel overwhelming to absorb unless you're researching it as a full-time career. But you've done something incredible in this book, and that is placing us in the room with historical figures like Tan Yunxian. And I mean, the sensory experiences throughout the book, from feelings of love to smells, to even feeling the pain of practices such as foot binding. You really feel like you're in the room with her, and it's incredible. And I think that's why so many people love the book. This must have taken a lot of research. I know we touched.
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
Right there? So actually, just when we finished talking about On Gold Mountain, I was going to add one thing, but you're kind of touching on it, which was, for that book, I used an epigraph, as the epigraph, a couple of sentences from Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose. I don't know if any of you have read that. And I don't have it exactly memorized, but it's pretty close. This is pretty close. Fooling around in the papers, my grandparents, especially my grandmother, left behind, I get glimpses of lives close to mine. I'd like to live in their clothes a while. And so I didn't know when I used that for the first book that was what was going to inspire me all the way to today. That idea of living in their clothes, of being, as you said, in the room. That's all I want to do, is just be in the room. And I remember with Snowflower and the Secret Fan, which was the first time I wrote about foot binding, I had sent it to my agent, and she always has like 5 young women who she's training. Mm-hmm. And part of their training is they read the new manuscripts, right? And then they each write a letter, and I get it. And, they're just fresh out of college. And one of these young women wrote to me, and she's like, "You didn't criticize foot binding. You have to come out against it in your novel." I was like, "No, I just wanted to be in the room with that girl." Mm-hmm. And so that, you just touched on exactly what I feel when I sit down to write, and also to try to incorporate as much as I can the 5 senses. What something smells like, what you're hearing, what it feels like, what the weather, how the breeze feels on your arms, all of those senses that, again, help you, or, for me as a reader first, would help me be in the room with those people, and it helps to make it feel real. Yeah. So I hope.
Absolutely. For sure. So you've
So
accomplished.
you never got to your question. I just like interrupted. I'm so sorry.
No, no worries. I mean, you've accomplished just that. And even the example of these large family compounds that you describe in the book, I was reading through it, and I think a lot of us in the audience could agree. It almost feels like you're walking through that garden. I've never seen one of these in my life. Obviously never been to China before, but reading it really feels like you're walking through it. So I wanted to ask on the spirit of that, this must have taken a ton of research. So could you maybe share with us a bit more about your research process? And then has there ever been a piece of research you discovered where it was like an aha moment where you really wanted to include in the book?
Okay, so just remind me of the second part.
You
So
got it.
I wrote this started it in October 2020. So I had actually had already started doing research on another book, but when the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, all the libraries were closed, all the research libraries closed, all the archives closed, and of course, China was closed. And there was no way I could do that other book. And so I put that aside, and it wasn't until October that I came across Tan Yan-Chen. But still, everything was closed. And so I had to approach the research in a way that I had never had before. And I did a couple of different things. So one was I created a kind of an imaginary pot of money that would have included my airfare to China, hotel, food, transportation. And I used that to buy the books that I couldn't go see at UCLA Special Collections. And so I can remember the very first book I looked for, it was over $1,000. I eventually found a copy that was around $100. It was in terrible condition, but I wasn't buying it as a collector. I only needed what was inside. So, the great thing about a library is you can go, you can look, you think, oh yeah, this is going to be useful for me, or no, it isn't. I didn't have that luxury. I just had to, buy different things and hope that they would be useful. And I helped to build my library a little bit more. So that was one thing I did. The other was that I reached out directly to different scholars. So one of the first people, she was the first person I tried to find on the internet, was the woman who had translated miscellaneous records of a female doctor into English. And I'm looking, and I'm thinking, well, she could live in Australia, she could live in Antarctica, she could have been anywhere in the world. She lived in Santa Monica, about 10 minutes from my house. And while this was, long before vaccines and then everything, so we couldn't meet in person, but we did meet on Zoom a couple times a week. She sent me unpublished dissertations. She would send me different academic journal articles. She would send me notes saying, oh, so-and-so is giving a lecture on midwifery in the Ming Dynasty, at the university in Singapore tonight. You can watch it at 2 a.m, and I would. And so, that was all very helpful in it. And there were people that I reached out to that I never would have guessed would even respond to me, like the head of the China Studies Department at Harvard. And he ended up being so incredibly helpful and very generous with his time. But I think part of it was during the pandemic. Everybody was just, home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with their spouse, and so, I'll just say there's one man who area of expertise was the Ming Dynasty postal system. He was really generous with his time. He was so helpful to me. But I kept thinking, whenever I would talk to him, I would think about his wife in the other room, like, oh, thank God, I don't have to hear about the Ming. So I think I was able to benefit from that. And then just one last thing, which is by now I do have a certain amount of knowledge that I felt I could draw on. So China was closed. Her house no longer exists. But I have been to China, many times I've been to a lot of those big compound homes. I felt I could write about those very easily. One of the house that this one is modeled on is one that I've been to. The garden is kind of a combination of two gardens. One is the humble administrator's garden in Suzhou, another place I've been many times. And the other, and you can go, is the Chinese garden at the Huntington, which is modeled on the humble administrator's garden in Suzhou. And so, there were things that I felt like I had enough knowledge about that I didn't have to go to China to look at a garden, because I've been in a bunch of them, So, but again, it was very, very different. And I'm just finishing up a new book right now, and I went back to all the old ways that I used to do research. So I just think that this was like an aberration, a one-time thing.
Thank you for that. And just as a second part of that, I mean, was there anything you discovered in any of your books where you maybe didn't know before and you're like, oh my God, like I need to include
Well, everything,
that.
just about. I mean, so much of this, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe that, they did that or whatever. But what I will say, and I touched on it in that little clip up there, is when I'm doing research, there's things that will pop up. And if you have already read the book, you know the story of the worm. And the thing is, I see something like that, and if I wasn't holding this, I could do this a little better. I'm like, I'm going to use that. I'm like, ooh, this is so good. I'm going to use it. And then for me, it really becomes a matter of like, where is it in the story? Is it the beginning, the middle, or the end? Why is it there? What's the ripple effect? But I do all of my own research, and that's why, because to me, it's like a big treasure hunt. I never know what I'm going to find, but also, so often, those things that I find, it's just like, oh, I'm going to use that, and I don't, if I had somebody else doing the research, how would I ever have that experience?
Absolutely. Well, Lisa, a common theme throughout Lady Tan's Circle of Women and many of your other books is the exploration and bonds between women and our shared experiences through motherhood, childbirth, and friendship. In this book, we see women of different status, personalities, age. And I kind of want the audience to think about this question as we're talking about it. Who are your circle of women, and how have they impacted you?
Well, here's an interesting thing. You heard earlier, I work pretty hard, and I often think that I don't have that. I don't have a lifelong best friend, but I write about that a lot. And so although I did not have that experience myself, I did watch two examples of it. One, my mother had two best friends from 7th grade, literally until the day she died, so 72 years. And my sister has had a best friend from when they first started sharing a crib when they were 3 months old. So I have, I've watched my sister and Sasha their entire lives, and then with my mother, it was, I just watched all of it. And you see, especially in relationships like with my mother, this was 72 years that these three women were friends. And over the course of 72 years, there are going to be some ups and downs, right? So to see that, and I know I sort of digress, but that's that's one type of friendship that I don't have. And I don't think of myself as having a circle per se, but part of when I'm writing a book like this, it is an exploration for me. So like with Island of Sea Women, I've written a lot about forgiveness. It's a theme that crops up a lot in my books. Why? It's something I struggle with really pretty badly. And when I started that book, from the very beginning, I wanted to really look at forgiveness. And so that's what it's about. So this one, and sometimes I don't really understand what the journey is, But this one was very much, how do I say this? In the way that it takes Tanya and Shen a long time to realize her circles, it's also taken me a long time to recognize my own. So yes, I have a circle that's part of this group that I play tennis with. And then there's the circle that's family. And then there's the circle that is, other writers and publishing. That there are these ways that we create them, but also that we're incorporated, that sometimes we don't necessarily recognize. And so, her journey takes her, to the last chapter, right? To really realize that she is part of a circle, but she's also been creating them.
Well, this is your new circle of women.
Yeah.
So, what was so fascinating, and I hope this doesn't spoil anything in the book for those who haven't read it, but really early on in the book, Tanya and Shin loses maybe perhaps who we think of first when we think of our circle of women, and that's our mother figures in our life. And when we think about bonds, I mean, who's closer than a mother figure or grandmother? But throughout the book, you see her form these very unique bonds beyond the loss of her mother. One of them that I found fascinating was seeing the formulation of her relationship with her father's concubine. And could you maybe share with us more about the role that concubines played in these large family complexes?
Right. Well, you just made me so happy because Miss Tsao is my favorite character.
I loved her.
I loved her so much. And, I'm going to get to your question, but I just want to say something else first. So these books, I do write a pretty thorough outline because it's a historical novel. I really have to kind of follow, something. I can't just sit down and say, where's the story going to go today? She was only going to be in the first chapter, because they were going to get to the grandparents' house and that was going to be the end. But sometimes there are characters who just keep popping up. And she was one that she just kept kind of elbowing her way into the story.
Yeah.
And I think there was a real reason for that, which is she has this unbelievable wisdom. Mm-hmm. And she says, some of my favorite lines in the whole book that are about friendship. It takes a lifetime to make a friend, but you can lose one in an hour. All of those lines about friendship where she's really trying to help Tanya and Shen understand this relationship that she has with Mei Ling and value it. So I'm so glad you chose her.
I loved her.
I loved her. So the role of concubines. If you were a really wealthy man, you could have multiple wives, you could have multiple concubines, they'd all live in the same house together. The women, would spend all day together in the same room. I mean, to me, living in one of those big compounds where you're living with 40 to 100 of your husband's closest relatives, my idea of hell. I mean, there's no getting around it. But even beyond having to spend all day in the same room with your mother-in-law and maybe your daughters-in-law and your sisters-in-law, and you had to also be in there with all the women that your husband was sleeping with. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I think it must have just been so hard. I just think it would be hard all the way around. And the struggle for position in that room was never ending, and you'd come in, as Tanya and Shen does when she first marries into her husband's family, she's at the bottom of the ladder. Yeah. And it takes there are these certain steps you have to take to start climbing the ladder. But even if you're a concubine, you're just a piece of property, right? You can be bought, you can be sold, you can be discarded out in the street. But even within their group, they have a hierarchy. And in that room, there's pretty low on that scale. So, yeah, that was the role to
to please the gentleman of the house.
Well, Lisa, the concept of yin and yang, and I'm sure we've all seen this symbol before, maybe not have known exactly what it means and represents, but personally, I think reading the book really helped me understand the concept of yin and yang. How do you bring this ancient concept into the heart of your books, and how do you feel it resonates with modern readers, especially women, who maybe have a really hard time finding balance?
That's a hard one. That's a hard one. Well, I do think most of us, I mean, really at the heart of yin and yang are these opposites. I mean, you see it, black and white, man and woman, sun and moon, earth and sky, good and evil, wet and dry. I mean, and I think as we go through life, we're experiencing those really contrasting opposites all the time, right? I mean, they're around us all the time. So we're kind of navigating in that. It's not, I mean, it may be an ancient concept, but it's also one that very much pertains to our lives today. So I don't know.
No, that's perfect. I mean, when we talk about balance in the modern world, and in this book, Tanya Shin's a female physician. She's doing so while balancing her role as a traditional woman of the house with 4 kids and a husband. So I just think it's so interesting how she constantly brings up this concept, and she's trying to find her balance. So I think that what you said is perfect.
I mean, I did I guess it was just an interview only last night. And one of the questions from the audience was, why did you put so much of a contemporary spin on this character? And actually, I didn't. This is what makes her so unique, is that she was, at a time when Confucian thought went through culture, society, family. Confucius, he was a great thinker. Don't get me wrong. He was an incredible philosopher. But it's also true he didn't care very much for women. So he has all of these sayings, things like, when a girl, obey your father, when a wife, obey your husband, when a widow, obey your son. An educated woman is a worthless woman. That's a nice one. A good woman will never go more than 3 steps beyond her front door. But here was a woman who, as you said, did all that, gave the appearance of a proper Confucian woman. She married at 15. She had 4 children. She managed her husband's household by later in life. And yet, she completely broke the mold. Yeah. She was a doctor. She wrote this book. It's, of the 10,000 ancient Chinese medical texts, only 3 were written by women. This one is the oldest. If you think about the time that she was a doctor, so she publishes her book in 1511 when she was 50, so late 1400s. Now just think about how many doctors were there worldwide at that time. Yes, there was a medical school in London, I think, but really, what you saw, if we just take the Americas, for example, you might have had shamans, medicine men, medicine women, but there was very little in the way of professional medical training, whether it was of the Eastern tradition or the Western tradition. And within that, very, very few women worldwide. So you're taking something that was already really rare, and then she's, even more rare. So to me, it's not that I think we can recognize that she has contemporary aspects to her life, but she was like way out ahead of everybody, by like 500 years. And how, just one last thing, in her book, she's very self-deprecating. Oh, I'm just a woman, and I know the other doctors might not really approve of what I'm doing, but I'm just putting it out there for other women to use. You know, she tries to make her appear again as a sort of traditional Confucian woman, even as she's doing something that's really extraordinary.
Well, you see around the room today, and I hope that everybody had the chance to see some of the quotes from the book sprinkled around the room today. One of them that I would love to talk to you about is this one right here. Now it's time for me to create a wider circle of women so I can do for my daughters and other women what grandmother, Ms. Zhao, who we talked about, Mei Ling, and even Poppy have done for me. And this is later on in the book where she really realizes the role that these women have played in her life. Could you maybe tell us about the dialogue that she was having with herself when she came to this realization and what that means?
Yeah, I think it's actually what we were talking about earlier, and how she didn't really understand what was, how these things were being created around her, or that she was creating them herself. This actually, the best way to talk about it is just about the title of the book. So I'm terrible at titles. And I think there are only like 2 of my books that I've come up with the title, maybe 3. And this one, everybody had an idea. And I was keeping a running list. And it did get to be, I think, 22 different titles. And each one was really worse than the last. And some, came from my agent, those nice young women in her office, my editor, the publisher, the sales and marketing department at Scribner. I mean, everybody was sending these ideas. One of them had 10 words. I was like, nobody, it's hard enough when you go into a bookstore and you want to buy a book and you have to then remember 10 words. So it was like, forget it. Anyway, when I write the book, I do so many drafts and I turn it in. Then my editor and I work on it, so many more drafts. Then there's copy editing, and then page proofs and second page proofs. And so I probably see it about 20 times. And it was really close to the end. I think it was just and it was still, there was like a working title, but nobody liked it. And I didn't like it. And I was reading through this book, number 17, after that first chapter, Miss Sao and Tan Yen-chen travel to Wuxi with Poppy. And when they get to the compound, Tan Yen-chen overhears the 2 of them talking. And they say, she's now basically an orphan, but we need to put a little circle around her. I thought, that's interesting that's there. And then as I read through, kept reading through and checking for make sure the commas were all in the right place, that circle kept showing up all the way until this line up here, which is in the last chapter. And it was so clear. It was like the title was there all along. The theme was there all along. And then as soon as I saw that, though, it was just like, oh, this is perfect. But it was, I didn't, sometimes you get a title and now you have to go back and put something in the book to make, gotta use the title in there somewhere. But this was, I didn't have to add anything because it was right in there all along. And I think the fact that she doesn't recognize it. I mean, she overhears them, but she does think of herself as being, alone. And by the time she gets to this place, again, she has recognized the circles that have formed around her, but also the circles that she's formed. And so I think of the circle in 2 ways. One is this way, but the other is this way. And you have touched on it, and it's also in this quote, that in this novel, they're women of all sorts. They're the servants, they're concubines, they're the wives, they're the old spinster aunts, they're the ladies from the court who come to visit, they're working women like the midwife, the tile maker, the tiller woman, all the way up to the empress. Every class, every status that I could put in there. I mean, in real life, she didn't meet the Empress, but I had her in there because I was really thinking about how, well, a couple of things. One is who has control over women's bodies? This is something that they were, I'm sure, were arguing about in caveman days. They were arguing about it in her time. We're arguing about it now, and I suspect that when we're all living on Mars, people are still going to be discussing this question of who has control over women's bodies. But related to that is it doesn't matter whether you lived 500 years ago or right now today or 500 years from now. It doesn't matter where in the world you live, that women are all connected worldwide across time by our unique biology and physiology. And so that was what I was trying to get at. It wasn't just class. It was that it didn't matter if you were the lowest servant or the empress. If you've got a baby in there, there are only a couple ways it's going to come out.
Yeah. I thought it was fascinating the way the chapters in the book were divided into the 4 stages of a woman's life. First chapter being milk days, which represents her childhood, hairpinning days where she's a little bit older, rice and salt days, and sitting quietly. I thought that was an interesting one. Was this how women's lives were phased out during this time? Were these actual concepts?
Yes, yeah, that was an actual concept. And I also, I use that same breakdown for Snowflower and the Secret Fan. So, but I felt like I could do it again this time because the time, the phases of her life really did fit into those 4 phases. And plus, I do think that we all, most women sort of live that, right? That you're a little kid, you're sort of, under 7 years old, and that's one kind of thing. And then you go through that hairpinning time where, you're kind of in the world, you're looking for love, your mate, whoever that's going to be. And then when you're finally, if you do get married, you have this time period of a lot of chores, a lot of stuff you've got to do.
What I know.
Yeah. And then, later in life, you're sort of freed up. And so, traditionally that was really about widowhood, that, you're going to sit quietly until you can join your husband in the afterlife. But as many of you know, that also can become a time, we'll just say post-menopause, where life opens up in a lot of ways, as it did for her. I mean, there's a reason that book is published when she's 51, I think. That she's freed of a lot of the day-to-day responsibilities of raising a family.
So we all know that Tan Yun-shin was a real woman in real life, and this book brings her story to life. So, and I mean, it just blows my mind when you think about a 15th century woman wrote this book with 30-something cases, and now a room full of people listening to her story, thousands and thousands of years. It just blows my mind, and I think that's the most fascinating part about all of this. So I was really curious to ask you, if you had the chance to meet her, what would you tell her?
I think I'd give her my wrists and say, would you please see, tell me how I'm doing, please, and make me a remedy. I mean, that's what I would really want from her. And then, will you be my friend? Do you play tennis? I would love to meet her. But I think, if I did, the first thing I would want is for her to do the 4 examinations and fix me up.
So I know a really important topic right now, and I know we have the Friends of the Library in the room, is literacy. It's a huge topic right now in the world, and with such a large digital world that we all live in today, do you have any advice you would share with youth who may need some inspiration on reading, and maybe reading a book like Lady Tan's Circle of Women?
Yeah, I mean, and she was literate at a time when even in, most men were not literate in China or around the world. I mean, if you think about it. So, um, I, what I love about books, and what I would encourage people who don't, think they don't like to read, is that they're kind of different things. One is, I love a book when you open it up and you enter into another culture, another time, and maybe you're reading it because you want to know who the killer is, or you want to know who if the guy is going to get the girl at the end. But it also gives you this opportunity to explore other times, explore other cultures, learn about forgiveness in an easy way, think about friendship in a different way. So when you're reading like that, what is it that we're doing? We're really connecting to these characters, whether they're real or imagined. And we're thinking, or at least I do, what would I do in that situation? Would I be honorable, or would I betray someone? Would I rise to the occasion, or would I fail? And I think when we're doing that, when we're connecting to characters in that way, we're really connecting to what it means to be human. We're connecting to this larger idea of humanity. All the studies show that people who read are more empathetic. And so I don't know, if you say to someone who's 15 and not feeling like reading a book, you're going to get a lot more empathy if you start reading. But I do think there are ways to talk about that and share something that you've read, that you've loved, that has really changed your life or made you think about something differently. And I think that's the way to do it, is that your own enthusiasm can transfer to someone. Maybe they'll pick it up, maybe they won't. But the other thing is, there's so many ways to read a book now. You can read it as a book, you can read it electronically, you can listen to it. And so that there are these different ways that you don't have to sit there and read it if you, in the way we all learned when we were in elementary school. And so I just think that we have to acknowledge that actually people are reading a lot more than we give them credit for. And then just on the other side with nonfiction, I mean, I think it's pretty clear, it just in my own family, that education is what transforms you. It's one of the paths out of your life if you don't like where you started. And, my father was the first in his family to go to college. My mother was the first in her family to go to college. This, my great-grandfather, the one you saw on the screen, he was an incredible businessman. He was the first Chinese in America to own an automobile. He could not write his own name. So just, in a couple of generations to go from that to what my mother and father were able to accomplish. And so that's all I would say, is that, there are different kinds of reading, but that the more you can educate yourself, the more opportunities you have. Plus the empathy part.
Yeah. And forgiveness. This wasn't a planned question, but I just want to praise you on something. In my research on you, I found that you take the opportunity, or you've translated your books into
I haven't translated.
Oh yeah, but you've encouraged that as a normal part of your books, and the distribution of your books is to sell books that are translated in multiple languages. And I was like, well, you would think this is like a normal thing, or a lot of authors participate in that, but it's not. But you've taken that, and I mean, talking about expanding circle of women, and in the spirit of that, how many women have access to read this book and engage in conversations about this book because you've taken or approved that. And
Yeah.
so I thought I just wanted to praise you.
So my books have been published in 39 different languages. Lady Tan is up to 22 languages. I love to visit book clubs on Zoom. I have spoken to book clubs for this book in Israel, Italy, Australia, Canada, Newfoundland, um, um, Chile, Venezuela about a month ago. So it's really what I love about being able to do that is people do read books differently, just from their own cultural backgrounds. But there are themes that are universal, and there are relationships that are universal, and of course, certain emotions that are universal. So, you mentioned earlier, mothers. Now, mothers and fathers. Maybe you knew them, maybe you didn't. Maybe they loved you, maybe they didn't. Um, but we all, somewhere along the line, all of us had a mother and a father. So that's a universal. We all long for love. We've all experienced anger. We've all probably, I don't know, I'll just speak for myself, oh, I don't, some of those negative emotions, we'll just say. But those, those are universal. And so those kinds of things that transcend borders, I think. And so even though sometimes the particulars of a story, people will interpret it quite differently than maybe I intended, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. That just means they're experiencing it through their own eyes. But what they do connect to, again, are those kinds of, relationships, emotions that are that transcend borders.
Absolutely. Well, Lisa, as we wrap this up, I would love to give our community a sneak peek into what's next for you. Like I said, I've been following you on social media, and last Sunday, I was scrolling through when I came across this on your Instagram, and I was just sitting on my couch, and I nearly dropped my wine because I was so excited to ask you this. So maybe could you share, and this is in her caption on this post, she put that this is the next, or draft. First draft of your next book. Could you share with us or give us a sneak peek on what this is about?
Yeah. So I printed it out on Sunday. I started reading it on page 1 on Monday. And last night I was up half the night saying to myself, oh my God, this thing is so bad. But I know I can fix it, but it's like I know I've got a lot of drafts to go. So it was very exciting to print it out. And right today, I was just like, oh man, might take more than 11. But I always feel that way. So I know I shouldn't worry about it too much. So this one starts in China in 1870 and then comes here to Los Angeles. Los Angeles in 1870, only 5,000 people. It was a tiny, dinky, dusty, dirty, and extraordinarily violent town. It is considered to have been one of the most violent, if not the most violent, of all of the Wild West towns. So worse than Tombstone, worse than, you name it, it was worse. And of that 5,000, there were 180 Chinese. Of that 180, only 34 Chinese women. In 1871, actually we just had the anniversary last week, was the Los Angeles Chinatown Massacre, when 10% of the city shot, stabbed, and hung 10% of the Chinese, so 18 Chinese men and boys. This is considered to be one of the largest mass lynchings in the history of our country, certainly the largest here in California. So this is not the only thing the book is about, but it is in there. So spoiler, you'll get to it around page 250. I'm telling the story from the perspective of 3 real women who came here at that time. The first is a young girl, 15 years old, who was brought here in an arranged marriage to a much, much older merchant. And she wasn't here for very long before she was kidnapped and held captive for about 6 months. At the time, but even scholars today believe that her kidnapping eventually is the trigger for this massacre. And so I think of her as kind of the Helen of Troy of the piece. The next was the wife of the Chinese doctor. Now, this man, this is not long after the Civil War. We know from the Civil War, Western medicine was still quite primitive, but Chinese medicine had already been around for a couple thousand years. So he was very popular here. He had 2 clinics. One was, it wasn't even a Chinatown, it's just a couple of blocks, but one there. And then his other one was on Main Street at around 5th. So you can kind of visualize where that is in downtown Los Angeles. And he, you know, his customers, his patients were white. And he spoke 4 languages. He was very dapper. He had a gold watch and a gold diamond ring. He was the second person killed. And his wife became the first Chinese woman to sue the city of Los Angeles. And then the last is a composite of, again, 2 real women who were sold by their families in China, brought here, and sold into prostitution. Now, again, this is after the Civil War. Slavery's been outlawed. It's in our Constitution at that point. There was one exception, and it had to do with the sale and ownership of Chinese women in the state of California. And so these 2 real women in real life, from the moment they got here, they did everything they could to escape and find freedom. So again, 3 very, these are very different women, but really inspiring women who were here at this time that it's just hard even to, I have had to imagine it because I've been living with them for a good year and a half, but really hard, I think, for us to even think about what life was like here at that time.
Thank you for that. I mean, I was like trying to zoom in and I couldn't figure it out, but that was a lot more than I imagined you would share. So thank you. I know for one, I'm super excited for that. So looking forward to when that's out. Well, that wraps it up for our questions for the evening. I just want to give you another round of applause and thank you so much. It's been an honor, and I mean, this is just such a great conversation, and looking forward to your next book. And everybody who hasn't read Lady Tan Circle of Women, we are selling copies here today. Lisa's here to autograph them, so don't forget to do that.
And
Please.
What a beautiful job Mary did, right? Oh, just really, really beautiful. So beautifully prepared and great questions.
I probably watched every single one of your interviews. And wanted to, ask you some different questions. So I really appreciate it. I think this was a great conversation. So I know that some folks in the room probably have some of their own questions. So wanted to open up the floor. I know we have some staff in the room with some microphones. So I think we'll go in order of hands raised, and Lisa's here to answer some questions.
Is there a science where you can read 4 blood pressures or whatever that was to see what's wrong with people? I can barely read 1.
So yeah, in Chinese medicine, there are 28 standard pulses that they feel in the wrist. So obviously, this takes a lot of training, and it is one of the main diagnostic tools for traditional Chinese medicine.
I have 2 questions. One is, do you have a working title yet for your new novel?
Okay. So I just spoke to my editor yesterday about that question, and should I reveal it? And she was like, no. But I'm going to anyway. This is just the working title. It could change. Daughters of the Sun and Moon. See, it's a good one.
And then my second question is, where do you get your inspiration for the stories?
So where do I get my inspiration for the stories? Every book is completely different. I'll just, Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane, I was crossing the street with my husband going to the movies, and I saw up ahead of me an older white couple walking with their adopted teenage Chinese daughter between them. She had her hair up in a ponytail, swinging back and forth like this, and I just had this vision of her as being kind of like a fox spirit in her family. And in Chinese tradition, fox spirits can be quite naughty, they can be quite mischievous, but in their best moments, they um, can bring great love and help to create a family. And so when I saw this tail swishing back and forth, I was like, oh, she is like a fox spirit in that family, in the sense that through her presence, she had brought great love and it helped to create a family. And so although I had been thinking about writing about adoption from China 20 years, from one side of the street to the other side of the street, I knew what the next book was going to be and what my way in would be. With this one, it's kind of a long story, but it was during the pandemic. I was walking by my wall of research books, and the spine of one of the books kind of jumped out at me. I don't know why. Gray with slightly darker gray lettering, but it was like it just jumped into my hands. Reproducing Women, Pregnancy and Childbirth in the Ming Dynasty. And I opened it up. I had not only had it on my shelf for 10 years and not read it, I had never even opened it before. When I go crack, crack, crack. Anyway, I thought to myself, well, here we are in the middle of a pandemic. My life is over. Might as well start reading it right now. I got to page 19. There was a mention of Tan Shan. I thought, that sounds kind of interesting. I went and looked her up on the internet. It turned out her book was still in print in Chinese, but also in English. Although I'm a huge supporter of brick and mortar bookstores, I did order them on Amazon, and I had it the next day. And so instead of thinking about that one for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it was all of 26 hours. I won't go through all of them, just one more. Island of Sea Women. I was in a doctor's office, flipping through magazines like we all do, waiting to be called in. There was one tiny photograph, one tiny paragraph about these free diving women. I ripped that right out of the magazine and took it home. But it wasn't, like it was another 8 years before I decided that was the one I was going to write. So every single book has had a different origin to it.
Lady Tan's grandparents, her grandma and grandpa, were they really doctors? And did she live to 96?
Yes. So did everyone hear that? Okay. So her grandmother what was known as a hereditary doctor. She'd learned from her parents, who'd learned from their parents and their parents, and so on. And her grandfather was a literati doctor, meaning he learned how to be a doctor by reading books. I'll tell you which one I'd rather go to. And then she did live to be 96. The story in the novel, might be giving something away. She was quite sickly and came close to death many times. And there's this one time where she is so close to death, she can hear her husband and mother-in-law planning her funeral right by her bed. That was not good. And she writes about this in her introduction. And that very night, her grandmother, who at that point had been dead for a long time, came to visit. And her grandmother said basically, enough of this being sick business. You've got to pull yourself together. You're like an embarrassment to the family. And if you go to one of my old notebooks that you inherited from me, and you look on page 78, and you make the remedy that's in there, and you take it exactly as I wrote it, you're going to get better, and you're never going to get sick again. And this turned out to be true. Her grandmother, paraphrasing, said basically, well, as long as I'm here, I just want to let you know you're going to live to be 78 years old, which would have been a really remarkable age in, the 1500s. In this, her grandmother was wrong because she did actually live to be 96. That may show that she was a pretty good doctor.
In the book, she has her mother's bed, and she has all those little places she tucks up. Was that in her story too, or is that
no?
Something that
so the marriage bed is something I could have talked about this earlier when I said I had all kind of a body of knowledge. So this marriage bed is inspired by a marriage bed that's in my own family. You could go see it at the family store in Pasadena. And most marriage beds, and this is really only for elite families where the girl gets a big dowry, would have as part of her dowry a marriage bed where you have the platform and then these kind of high carved walls around it. Now, why would you have that? Because you're living in a household with between 40 and 100 of your husband's relatives plus all the servants, all these people wandering in and out all the time. And so this actually gave a couple some privacy. Anyway, the one that we have in my family is a little bit more elaborate. It's carved out of about 20 different types of wood. It has a big carved canopy with carved wooden tassels that hang down. You enter first, the first room is where the servants slept on the floor in case you needed anything in the night. The next room was a dressing room. Then through a carved moon gate onto the sleeping platform that was surrounded on all sides by, like where the windows would be, by these paintings on silk showing scenes of domestic life. You know, young couple walking by the stream. He's writing love poetry to her. She's playing an instrument. This was my playhouse when I was a child. This is where I played with all of my cousins. It's where my sons played with their cousins, and now we're just waiting for the grandbabies to get old enough that they can play in there too.
So talking about your family, I just want to mention that when I was a little girl, I grew up with Clara. And as an adult, your mom reached out to me and gave me writing advice, which was phenomenal. And one of the things she talked about was always be open to every reader every time. And I have seen in your career that you take that to a really high level. And I read somewhere that you said that you have never said no to a book club. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart as a reader, that is so beautiful. Writers who make themselves accessible to readers, we love you for it. Thank you.
Thank you. And what's your name?
My name is Melina Simple Watts. I wrote the book Tree that you
Oh,
very kindly
yes,
said you
okay,
liked.
Melina. Melina Watts. Yeah, okay. I know who you are now. So I have to say, by now, I say no to book clubs every single day. I'm sorry, because I really don't. I can't. I mean, during the pandemic, because I had nothing else to do, I spoke to as many as 4 a day. Yeah, I mean, it was, but I still do, you know, a few a week, every week, and I love it. I feel like I learn so much from book clubs, and they're fun, and it's, you know, and like I said earlier, I've talked to book clubs all over the world, including one in Iran. And, you know, I'm like looking in the background, like, what kind of furniture do they have in there? You know, and it's, you know, there's this aspect where you're invited into someone's home. And it, you know, I try to make it feel like it's more of just a conversation. You know, they ask me questions, I answer. And, you know, sometimes they're drinking a lot of wine and sometimes they're, you know, very serious. But I've just learned so much from them. And, yeah. Send me a note. If I can join, I will. And if I can't, I always have all kinds of fun stuff to send to book clubs. Oh, when I address the issue of AI, well, I'm not for it. I think I know that remember about a year ago, there was that first big introductory company that had taken about 1,000 books and you can type in, like, write a chat, you know, a story making it sound like Lisa C. My sister has done that, and it's like, hey man, that thing's pretty good. You know? But I mean, I don't know what we're going to do about it. I think the horse is out of the stable on that one, but it is a big issue, and but I don't know what we can do. And I think the other thing is that it's infiltrated our lives in ways that we don't, you know, I don't think most of us are even aware of. One of my sons has to take a new medication that if he had to pay for it would be $4,000 a month. The insurance company, of course, doesn't want to pay for it. The letters that go between the doctor and the insurance company on both sides are both written by AI. So that means, like, I don't know your doctors, you know, but your doctor's office, when they're talking to your insurance company, it may be just being written by AI. And somewhere in there, you need to have a person who says, you know, this guy needs to have this shot, you know, he needs this medicine. And let's, you know, stop. And he's seen the letters and he's watched. I mean, they showed him how they do it. And it's just, that's far more worrisome to me than if somebody copies my, types in Lisa C, whatever, I mean, I think that's much more concerning.
Hi, Lisa. I have read every single one of your books. The first was on Gold Mountain, which I loved, and I went around telling everybody the history of the Chinese people in Los Angeles. I took my children to the Gene Autry Museum on field trips because there's a whole C family.
There was,
It's
yeah.
it's not an exhibit. It's the children can wear the Chinese clothes and they can play in the kitchen and the little store that's there, and it was just a remarkable experience for them. And my favorite has been the new one, Lady Tan's Circle of Women. That is absolutely my favorite. And the minute I get an announcement that your new book is being published, it's already pre-ordered on my Kindle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How did I get started writing? So my mother was a writer and my mother's father was a writer. I actually thought I didn't want to be a writer. You look at what your parents do and your grandparents do, you think, I don't think so. And also, I don't know how many of you are familiar with my mother's work, Carolyn C., and she wrote many novels, all of them in about Southern California. She used to review a book a week for the LA Times and later the Washington Post. There are people who kind of consider her the godmother of Southern California letters. When she started out in the 1960s, there were no other women writers out here. I mean, let's just, we all love Joan Didion. She wrote her first book and went to New York and never came back. There just really weren't very many women writers. I mean, there just weren't. They just didn't exist. And I have these very clear memories of my mother sitting on the couch. She always had her legs up, and on the phone with an editor who would be just ripping her and her writing apart, and she'd be crying and crying, and she was like the first. She was like a Lady Tan herself, and I just thought, I don't want that. I really don't want that. Okay, so jump ahead. Her father liked the ladies, and he was on his fifth wife, who was 2 weeks either younger or older than my mother. And Linda gave birth to my Uncle Bob, and my mom and I and Clara, we all drove down to visit the baby and help. And at this point, my mom was a single mother. She was trying to survive on her writing. She was teaching. She was doing some, I don't think any of her books had come out yet, but she was doing magazine work. So the way she really supported us was as a expert witness in pornography trials. And we went down to visit the baby, and she had this whole stack of books to read that were sitting there on the kitchen table. And my grandfather, I just have such a vivid memory of this. I mean, who wouldn't be depressed 69 years old with a brand new baby? I mean, he was just, and my mom said, Dad, why don't you read one of these books? It might cheer you up. So he, took a book, went down the hall, came back a couple of hours later, and he really was cheerful. And he's like, I could do better than that. I know I could do better than that. And from that point until when he died, he wrote and published 74 hardcore pornographic novels. So I really didn't want to be a writer. Jump ahead of some further along. And I've been in college for 2 years. I've been saving up my money, and I'm going to go to Europe. I've been saving up, working all these different jobs. I'm going to go to Europe, and I'm never going to come back. And I had this vision of myself. I never want to get married. I never want to have children. I don't want to be a writer, and I always want to live out of a suitcase. And so I was bumming around in Europe, when you could do it on $5 a day or less. And, but, there is a problem. If I had this vision in my mind, I was going to need to earn a living. And so we're bumming around, and I'm thinking, like, how can I do this? And there came a point, I was living in Greece. I had rented a house, $35 a month, 10 feet from the water. Yeah, this is how old I am. So Anyway, there was this one morning I woke up and it truly was like a light bulb, like a light bulb. It's like, oh, I could become a writer. And it was about 6 more months before I came home, before my little bit of money ran out. And within the first 48 hours, I had my first 2 magazine assignments. Both of them came through my mom, and I've been writing ever since. So, you know, I clearly didn't know myself very well. I was only 19. I did get married. I do have kids. I became a writer. I have spent a lot of time living out of a suitcase, and I can say the bloom is totally off that rose.
I think that's all the questions for the evening. We do want to save some time for you all to meet Lisa in the lobby, but one more round of applause for Lisa C.
Can we also have a huge round of applause for our moderator, Mary Haddad? Thank you so much, Lisa. It was wonderful. Thank you all for coming to our One City, One Book program.